The darkest moment may be that moment just before the dawn of a great fulfillment.
When the Civil Rights Act hit a blockade in Washington,
it is one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation ever presented to the Congress.
Dr. King came to Florida to lead a decisive battle in the brutal summer of 1964.
You may have beaten me, but you haven't defeated me.
Hear the untold story of how the city of St. Augustine became the epicenter of America's civil rights movement.
I started pouring acid in the pool. Our whole foreign policy and everything else go to hell over this.
And the guys tried to get us out, and we weren't getting out. I didn't know anything about those pictures until I saw them in the papers. When I saw them, I said, damn.
We'll travel from Tampa to St. Augustine to Atlanta to meet the legends and the leaders.
You don't get mad, you stay smart.
From Dr. King's top lieutenant, Andrew Young.
Their faith was so strong.
To the army of students who would not back down.
How did your family feel about your integrating the schools?
My mother was a nervous wreck.
Through waves of beatings, firebombs, and bullets, see how a peaceful uprising prevailed.
It's the way to go.
And see how the next generation is carrying the torch.
Daddy said, men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other.
We'll sit down with Dr. Bernice King, who now leads the King Center to keep her father's dream alive.
This is a win for justice.
This is the story of Florida's foot soldiers that starts long ago on the walkway to freedom.
St. Augustine might well pave the way for a new century of freedom for all.
We've learned how America's Underground Railroad freed slaves from the south to the north, but it also ran in the other direction. More than 100 years before the heroics of Harriet Tubman, the original Underground Railroad ran from the north to the south, from the British colonies to the Spanish city of St. Augustine. Escaped slaves could live in freedom if they joined the militia and pledged allegiance to Spain.
And so many came that by 1738, the Spanish governor established a free black community called Fort Mose as the northern defense of the city.
He knew freed slaves would be powerful warriors in defending the city from British raids.
To the British, okay, you can try and invade us if you want, but first you got to get through these people who just escaped from slavery at your hands. And it was a perfect strategy.
They fought for their freedom, and so did their descendants. In the U.S. Civil War, the Union controlled St. Augustine within a year. And many of the African-American soldiers who then fought for the Union, as told in movies like Glory,
Ante up and kick in like men. Like men!
Well, they came from St. Augustine.
And some of them after the war came and settled here, and they formed a kind of leadership cadre for the black community in St. Augustine.
So to those who ask how St. Augustine became the center of America's civil rights movement and what drove the activists, well, part of it's in their legacy and in their blood.
Everybody should know this, but so few people do.
Fast forward to February of 1960. 4 students in a North Carolina Woolworth started the first wave of sit-ins, with black and white students sitting together at a segregated lunch counter. That sparked the St. Augustine movement within a month, and it just kept going as students like Alfred Davis streamed into their local Woolworths.
And they said, y'all need to get out of here. You know you're not supposed to be in here. We just want a glass of water, want a soda, want a Coke or something.
And that's how he got arrested 4 times by the age of 12.
And then they let you go and tell you don't come back. And everybody agreed, okay, well, we're not coming back. But then the next day, we're back again.
Then in July of 1963, 4 of the students, including Alfred's future sister-in-law, would not even pretend to stand down. They planned to keep going back and wanted the judge to know it.
From the get-go, they said, we're not going to sign anything, we're just going to come back.
Right. They were a little older, so they had a little more guts than I did, I guess, at that time.
The 2 girls, Audrey Nell Edwards and Joanne Anderson, got a 1-year sentence and hard labor in prison. And they sent Willie Carl Singleton and Samuel White to a reform school that you may have heard about.
The notorious Alfred Dozier Reform School for Boys in Marianna, Florida. It's now been closed and they're digging up bodies. And both of them wound up dying before their time, and neither would ever talk about what happened to them there.
Their sentences drew national shame as America's oldest city planned its 400th birthday party to be funded by the federal government.
Next year we will be celebrating our 400th
quadricentennial anniversary.
A dentist named Robert Hayling pressed city leaders to give African Americans a meaningful role in planning the party. And when they did not deliver, he produced some events of his own. He had already been a mentor and father figure to many of the young protesters. And in the summer of 1963, he turned up the heat, with marches during the day and marches at night.
He was a person who stepped out on the basis of his intelligence, on the basis of his commitment, and was willing to pay the price.
As the peaceful protest took off, the Ku Klux Klan streamed into town to applause in the streets. Hayling didn't know what to expect from the Klan. So in September of '63, he tried to sneak into the woods during a Klan rally, and James Jackson and 2 other friends came along.
We could get into the back of it and eavesdrop.
They didn't realize the Klan had scouts who caught and dragged them in front of their burning cross.
I had a man with a 12-gauge shotgun about 6 inches away from my face.
The Klansmen checked the men's wallets and discovered they had captured Hayling.
And a dentist needs his hands in order to perform their duty.
So they crushed Dr. Hayling's hands, broke his teeth, and bashed all 4 of them in their heads.
It was a person behind me with a lug wrench that hit me in the back of my skull, and I suffered a fracture. Somebody came up with the suggestion, let's hang those ends. No, let's shoot those ends. No, let's castrate those ends.
Based on multiple accounts, the mob settled on dousing them with gasoline,
setting us on fire.
Thankfully, a white civil rights supporter had infiltrated the rally, heard men, women, and children calling for murder, and snuck away to call the FBI to intervene and save them. It all made national news, and so did this. Only 4 of the Klansmen went on trial for the attack, but they said they had felt threatened, and they were freed, while an all-white jury convicted Hayling for assaulting the Klan. By early 1964, Hayling had his house shot up, his dog killed, the Klan firebombing homes on African-American streets, firing shots into cars, and the city banned the night marches. It was time to call in the cavalry, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. answered the call.
Nobody in America can really be free until all of us are free.
One of the things that, say, Reverend Shuttlesworth and Dr. Hayling understood was that if Martin Luther King showed up in the town, that helped bring the press.
King's top lieutenant Andrew Young won a court battle to reinstate the night marches. But as Dr. King sized up the situation, he feared the St. Augustine movement could backfire, so he tried to turn down the heat just as it erupted in a striking twist. Coming up, cross signals and the cross street.
Even though I wanted to stop, I got there and realized that we couldn't stop.
Dr. King answered a call from St. Augustine, but he did not plan to make it the focal point of the movement until the plan went off script and set off the flashpoint.
After Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks defied segregation, Dr. Martin Luther King led the Montgomery bus boycotts, where segregationists retaliated with firebombs. He led the Birmingham campaign, where segregationist police boss Bull Connor used attack dogs to rip into peaceful protesters and fire hoses to burn and blow them away, and where a bomb killed 4 little girls at church. Throughout the Jim Crow South, King knew more about tragedy and injustice than he ever cared to learn. And yet he named St. Augustine, Florida, as the most lawless city he'd ever seen.
The sheriff actually deputized the Ku Klux Klan.
Now the picket line should go on down around the slave market once, on down to the information center and back through town.
Andrew Young was Dr. King's strategist and writer, planner, and chief negotiator, the one player King deemed too valuable to enter the fray.
Everybody else was getting beat up, everybody else was going to jail, and Dr. King wouldn't let me go to jail.
Historically, a top lieutenant symbolically sat to a leader's right, which is where we get the term right-hand man. And it's where Young picks up the story as King's right-hand man and lead diplomat with city officials.
I met with Andrew Young, the program director for Martin Luther King.
Here's how the mayor described the meeting.
Being the oldest city, we were symbolic and they would be able to achieve their aims of publicity in furthering their movement, that they were going to continue to harass and disturb the peace in St. Augustine.
Is that how you remember the conversation?
I don't remember the conversation that way at all. In fact, that was never my message. My message was that we want to find a way to live together as brothers, because constant conflict would lead us to perish together as fools.
And while Dr. King sent Young to negotiate with the mayor, he sent one of his organizers, Hosea Williams, to help coordinate peaceful protests. And Hosea Williams didn't mess around.
He's the type of person to go and get you to stand up.
And peacefully marched till they took you to jail.
Jail duty, we called it. Hosea got up that night. Well, who's going to jail tomorrow? Well, what about you? Well, Hosea, I just went to jail yesterday. Well, you're going back tomorrow.
And not just the local students. Black and white students from other states like Al Lingo rode into town.
Police sort of backed away and people threw whatever they wanted to throw at you.
This photo shows Lingo getting sprayed with beer as he followed Hosea Williams' lead.
Hosea Williams was kind of a genius of seeing what could irritate violent people.
For example, Williams recruited senior citizens from the North to join the protest and get arrested, like Mary Peabody, mother of the sitting governor of Massachusetts. And he bragged about it, and it did aggravate violent people, and it drew Klan groups from across the country. And this really worried Andrew Young and Dr. King.
He didn't want any violence from the black community.
Unlike the students of Birmingham, many had not been trained to drop their hands when attacked and be willing to take a beating. Combine that with the weapons Highway Patrol kept finding and seizing.
These 8 weapons were taken off the same person at different times in a 2-day period.
Combine that with the firebombs and bullets and prior Klan attacks. It's all context for why King called this the most lawless city.
News photographers became a target of white segregationists who attacked the photographers and smashed their equipment.
And why he feared it could ignite a brawl from both sides and ruin everything.
I mean, if there'd been a riot in St. Augustine, it would have killed the Civil Rights Bill. And we didn't want that.
So King sent Young back to St. Augustine with orders to hit the brakes and stop the next big march. But Hosea Williams flipped the script.
And I show up in the church, and Jose says, "Look here, Dr. King has sent the Reverend Andrew Young down to lead this march."
Uh-oh.
Before I had a chance to say anything to him.
And he knew a mob of Klansmen had gathered where they planned to march because he drove by them on his way to meet the marchers in church.
But this was women and old women and children. It was stupid and inhumane to let them march into that mob.
But after Hosea Williams roused them, they weren't backing down.
And I thought to myself, well, if I lead the march, I can get them close enough to the Klan that they will come to their senses and realize that it doesn't make sense.
He walked them to a corner where they could see the mob ahead.
I got in a circle and I explained to them what Dr. King said. I said that I can't stop the march, but I'd be glad to lead this march back to the church. That's what Dr. King would have us do. And I said, we'll stop and pray about it. When we prayed, and I was praying that everybody would want to go back to the church, somebody started this hymn, "Be not dismayed, whatever betide, God will take care of you." I said, oh, Lord.
He told them to hang tight while he crossed the street.
I could maybe go over by myself and reason with the Klan. And it amazes me that I wasn't the least bit afraid. I had been talking to racist people all my life. Well, I started talking, and I was doing all right talking to the leaders. And then somebody broke through, hit me with something. From then on, I didn't know anything.
We had about 6 or 7 individuals stomping, kicking, hitting Andy with all kinds of things.
In fact, when I got beat up, the only television camera there was held by the policeman, because I really didn't know what happened. I was out. They beat me down, and I guess I was unconscious, but somebody picked me up.
Then he came to.
And I said, we can't turn back now.
A policeman convinced the mob to back down and let them through.
What the Klan guy said when we started walking through was, "Them has got some nerve." And this old lady, probably 67, 70 years old or so, shouted out, "It's not nerve, son, it's faith."
The marchers did not fight back as King had feared they might, and they were tested again when the segregationists led a countermarch into the African-American neighborhood of Lincolnville.
Nearly 300 whites marched into the Negro area.
But the families greeted them with love.
Most of the women were dressed in white. They started singing, "I love everybody. I love everybody in my heart."
And that's when you realized, and Dr. King realized, there's your epicenter.
That's it.
Waves of sit-ins going to Walgreens, McCartney's, and Rexall. I understand Mr. McCartney doesn't call the police. He takes a broom to them or something.
Andrew Young said he was sent to St. Augustine to kill a movement, but by the grace of God, he failed.
The people who are the leaders are the people who do the suffering. If you don't bear the cross, then you can't wear the crown.
Even though I wanted to stop, I got there and realized that we couldn't stop. We were thinking politically, including Dr. King at first. But the people down there were thinking spiritually. Their faith was so strong.
The giants of America's freedom struggle converged on St. Augustine. Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, C.T. Vivian, and thousands of young foot soldiers, black and white, joined King, Young, and Hayling in the decisive battle for the Civil Rights Act. King said it's hotter in more ways than one in St. Augustine.
We need not despair because we are on the side of right. And if you are right, God will fight your battle.
Coming up, a line in the sand and the jug of acid that sears into America's soul.
These were extremely powerful images to the world to show them why that change had to happen.
This is Senator Richard Russell. They named the oldest Senate building after him in Washington. They also named the federal courthouse here in Atlanta in his honor. But he's the man who led the fight against the Civil Rights Act and could have defeated it.
We shall resist until the end.
Until the Battle of Florida and a bottle of acid in a St. Augustine pool.
We met Cora Tyson shortly after her 100th birthday, nearly 60 years after a decisive battle for civil rights that Dr. King planned from her living room.
Reporters was in and out of my house at all the time because he was there. That's where they would meet with him.
She seldom tells the story that we're about to hear.
We don't talk about the movement. We remember too much.
And you don't want to remember too much because?
It hurts.
When Dr. King's trusted Lieutenant Andrew Young came to St. Augustine, Cora let him stay in her house.
That's the sweetie pie. And then I got along very well. We would laugh and talk.
And when he led the march that took him down, it broke her heart.
When he got beat up that night, it just upset me. I just cried and cried all night.
But Young's beating stirred something in the civil rights leaders and students across the nation, and it focused the struggle on St. Augustine. And as waves of buses rolled in, Cora filled her home with students.
The black children couldn't stay in the motels. They didn't know where to stay.
And Andrew Young was back, along with a certain somebody else who needed a place to stay.
I said, Andy, just what do you want with me? He said, I want you to meet somebody. I said, who am I supposed to be me?
He said, I'd like you to meet Dr. King. And she didn't say anything. She just screamed for joy.
I said, Dr. King, look. He said, I've been greeted many times. He said, but this cream of the crop.
The students stayed upstairs. Dr. King and the Brain Trust stayed downstairs. Cora stayed busy.
He loves seafood. I do seafood, shrimp.
And for Dr. King, a big part of leading this nonviolent movement was convincing the followers to remain peaceful as they continued to get battered.
And I told him, I said, I am sick of your nonviolent stuff. He said, Sister Tyson, he said, this is the way it's supposed to be. I said, well, if you hit me, I'm going to hit you back. He said, no, you can't do it that way.
The beauty of this struggle.
See the young man behind Dr. King to the left? That was Alfred Davis.
And he started speaking, and I was not aware of the magnitude of what was going on. And, you know, I know Martin Luther King said nonviolence, but when you're at 10, 11, 12 years old and somebody throws a rock or hits you, your instinct is to fight back.
And as one of the first 6 students to integrate the local schools, that happened a lot.
Not here, black eye here, a knot on my head there. When we were demonstrating after Dr. King was here, a hail of rocks were being thrown, and I got hit on my right ankle with one of the rocks at that time.
That broke his foot, but helped strengthen his mind and heart.
And it was almost like a voice going off in my head, and why fight violence with violence, because it's only going to beget violence. And perhaps this time I can be more like him.
From here, the battle played out on 3 fronts. One in Washington, where Russell led a Senate filibuster against the Civil Rights Bill that would ban discrimination based on race, religion, sex, or national origin in all public places.
With the vicious, iniquitous Civil Rights Bill.
The House had already passed it, but with a Russell-led blockade, the Senate could not.
It is one of the most dangerous pieces of legislation ever presented to the Congress.
A second front opened on St. Augustine's segregated beaches.
Because this is a public beach and there should be no segregation then.
Blacks and whites walked into the water together, and the white mob responded with a blaze of clubs and fists.
These individuals came prepared for war.
And a group of whites attacked a racially mixed group of demonstrators at Atlantic Ocean Beach.
I saw individuals running in fear of their life.
And while you're watching somebody with a club, somebody else strikes you from your blind side.
This young man came up with this 1x2 type club with a drawn back to hit me. And I questioned him, why are you attacking me? Why are you going to hit me? Because you belong at your own beach.
James Jackson said, but it's all the same water, which confounded and disarmed his assailant.
He dropped his club and walked away.
But others kept swinging.
A Danish cameraman taking motion pictures of the violence was beaten by a shirtless white youth who fled down the beach.
And it all made national news day after day, with accounts of the water turning red with blood, putting more pressure on Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act.
As a group of whites attacked about 75 integrationists during a wait-in demonstration.
What happened?
Yeah, I was cut my eye. I'd go get stitches beneath my eye.
What did they strike you with?
Best I know was a fist.
The third front of the battle lit up downtown.
As about 500 angry whites crashed through police lines and attacked Negro demonstrators.
This had been going on for a while, but it took a pivotal turn 2 days after Andrew Young's beating.
I have definitely committed myself to participating by going to jail if necessary.
Dr. King tried to get seated at a segregated restaurant at the Monson Motor Lodge Motel and got arrested for trespassing. And there's Andrew Young leaning into the squad car.
And so they put a German Shepherd in the back of the car with Martin, thinking he'd be afraid. Well, Martin had a German Shepherd when he was 3 years old.
So he rode into jail petting and comforting the dog.
It kept his mind off of his situation.
And after writing his famous letter from Birmingham jail a year and 2 months before, King wrote his letter from a Florida jail. He reached out to Rabbi Israel Dresner, a freedom rider who had been arrested at a Tallahassee sit-in 3 years before. King wrote, "We need you down here with as many rabbis as you can bring."
One of his oft-made speeches was, "We have been in the Egypt of slavery. We've wandered in the wilderness of separate but equal. And now it's time for us to move into the promised land of creative integration. Well, that was the same thing these rabbis were preaching.
And when King got out of jail, he returned to the Monson with a lot of friends who prayed, picketed, and tried to eat together.
We have some dear white friends here who are with us, and we want to eat together. But because of this system, they would have to eat up front and we would have to eat in the back. We can't even communicate.
The owner of the Monson, James Brock, was the perfect foil for the climactic day of the movement.
Encourage your nonviolent army to peacefully solicit some other property other than mine.
Brock got increasingly agitated.
Let us have prayer at this place.
Look here.
Let us have prayer for the manager of this place.
You're not having
Let
any
us
prayer
have prayer
here.
also.
You're not having any prayer here.
Brock pushed him away, news cameras rolling.
You're on private property. You go too.
16 rabbis got arrested, news cameras rolling. Meanwhile, white civil rights activists like Al Lingo also checked into the Monson Motel. And then after they got their keys, revealed they had black guests.
We knew we were doing something.
And then they jumped into the pool together. That's Lingo in the striped swim trunks.
Hi, boy. Hi, sir. How are you?
And the guys tried to get us out, and we weren't getting out.
Brock rushed over with a jug of muriatic acid, news cameras rolling, and terrorized the swimmers by pouring the acid into the pool.
I mean, it could sting a little, but that's, I wasn't worried about it. But the young black women were worried about it.
Turns out it wasn't enough acid relative to the volume of the water in the pool to cause a serious health threat. But it was more than enough to shock the nation's conscience, as Brock poured the acid and terrorized the swimmers, and police arrested the swimmers.
And then they got a policeman to come flying through the air, land in the water. Poor guy, had his clothes on. I remember Martin King standing in that crowd, just laughing and laughing and laughing at this comedy of these people trying to get us out of the pool. Pictures don't hold the joy and the humor that was there in a trick that had been pulled on segregationists by a group of civil rights workers.
It rattled the White House.
I started pouring acid in the pool. Our whole foreign policy and everything else go to hell over this.
But it also rattled the politicians in Congress enough to break Russell's blockade of the Civil Rights Act.
I didn't know anything about those pictures until I saw them in the papers. When I saw them, you know, I said, damn.
You have done something for this community, and you've done something for this nation.
If anybody was a wavering vote, they just had to look at that picture and say, that's not the America we want. Let's pass this law.
The Senate passed it the very next day. King celebrated the victory in St. Augustine and won the Nobel Peace Prize 6 months later.
Every 1,000-mile journey begins with the first step.
His next step would take him to the Battle of Selma, Bloody Sunday, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A sniper killed him in 1968. Those who knew him say King sort of expected that's how it would go.
He said, I love to live, to see my 4 little children get up, graduate, march down the aisle when they finish school. He said, but I don't think I'll live to see that.
Andrew Young picked up the movement, then got elected to Congress, then served as America's ambassador to the United Nations.
President Carter led the prolonged applause in the White House East Room for the swearing-in of Andrew Young to be the new U.S. ambassador to the United Nations.
Then mayor of Atlanta and leader of the '96 Olympics. But before any of that, he had some unfinished business in St. Augustine.
I ended up with a pretty good relationship with the mayor. And once we stayed in somebody's home, that meant that their home was vulnerable to drive-by shootings.
And they came back to town. I said to him, I said, what you doing here? And he laughed. He said, I came back to check on you.
She had seen police cars circling around her house and couldn't figure out why.
And they said, have you seen any patrol cars? I said, sure. I said, what's that about? He said, they'll be here for 6 months.
The future ambassador had worked a deal to keep her safe.
He said, they'll be protecting your house.
And he signed her Bible.
Yours is a freedom home. God bless you for the vital part you have played in the movement.
That's Young's signature, along with the others, Hosea Williams, C.T. Vivian, Fred Shuttlesworth, Ralph Abernathy, and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.
To know that these giants of the civil rights movement changed the course of history from your living room.
That's right.
What goes through your head and heart when you sit in your living room?
I just sit there and thank the Lord.
Coming up, saving history and lessons from the civil rights pioneers that come into play here today.
The beauty of this struggle, and we see it here in St. Augustine, is that we have white people who are as concerned about this problem as we are.
For more than 400 years, America's oldest city preserved colonial history, but not its most important battle in modern history.
Many of the most important civil rights sites have been demolished.
For one thing, the powers that were in St. Augustine were on the losing side of that battle. And they didn't want to publicize that.
Mary Peabody, mother of the governor of Massachusetts, got arrested for trying to eat with black friends at a hotel lodge long gone, except for a door.
Well, they started its demolition exactly on the 75th birthday of Martin Luther King.
The Monson Motor Lodge, where Dr. King took his stand, and with it the pool where the black and white swimmers endured a jug of acid, also demolished. A plaque hangs in its stead. The Woolworths where the sit-ins took off is gone, though you can still make out part of the name on these worn door handles.
There was just an attitude, that's all bad stuff, we don't want anything to do with it.
Until the 1970s, when the city hired historian David Nolan, and his new boss told him this funny little story that starts like this.
And this idiot, this complete idiot, raised his hand and said, "What are you going to do about the historic houses connected with Martin Luther King?" He said, but I had the perfect answer for him. I said, "It wasn't 50 years ago, so it's not historic." I said, "Mike, I was that idiot." I think he was sorry he hired me, but...
Nolan became the guardian of the city's civil rights history, working to preserve what's left. And there was still quite a bit that tells the story of Dr. Hayling the catalyst, Hosea Williams the motivator, Andrew Young the diplomat, and Dr. King, the man who led a cast of thousands.
We have committed ourselves to staying here until that is a meaningful resolution of the problems facing this community.
Well, Dr. King gave a news conference that played around the world from this yard, which was just a few steps away from where he stayed at Cora Tyson's house, which was just a few steps away from one of the churches where thousands of students gathered to head off to the wait-ins and to the marches, which was just a few steps away from Dr. Hayling's dental office.
They turned Dr. Hayling's office into a small museum, where you'll find the old sign to the Monson Motor Lodge.
And this has been on display in the state capitol.
And an original seat from the Woolworths lunch counter, Mary Peabody's hat, and much more, including Cora Tyson's Bible.
Mrs. Cora Tyson lives today.
And about every 20 to 30 minutes,
She actually was a cafeteria school manager.
tour guides retell the story as the trams roll past.
Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. stood with Cora and her family on many occasions when he visited.
A few blocks down, a plaque marks the home where Alfred Davis integrated the local schools.
Somewhere in my heart, I knew it had to be a change.
And they renamed the street Andrew Young crossed at the turning point of the movement as Andrew Young Crossing. Footsteps in concrete lead to the spot where the mob took him down and turbocharged the movement.
That corner is very important to me. It probably is, I think of as the most important day in my life.
The town's old slave market became a focal point of the demonstrations, as it apparently became a symbol of Negro efforts to integrate the nation's oldest city.
And now next to the old slave market, you'll find this monument to the foot soldiers of the freedom struggle, the men and women whose names may not appear in history books, but whose actions helped pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and change the course of history. When you got beaten and did not swing back, how did you feel after that?
My pride was hurt, but somewhere inside at different times that happened, I knew it was the right thing.
with so much violence in the world today, now that I look back at it, it's the way to go.
And that's how Dr. King got through to you.
Yes, I got through to me.
And those who back then thought it was acceptable to throw bricks at people or pour acid in pools or something, those are not the heroes of St. Augustine. Those are the people we're ashamed of. And that says something good about our soul.
Coming up, lessons from Ambassador Young and his advice for students today. Ambassador Andrew Young has some striking memories of his work with Dr. King, but we'll start with the wisdom Young took from his father.
He said, don't get mad, get smart. He said, if you lose your temper in a fight or in an argument, you cut off your mind and you're left to nothing but your fist and your feet. The best thing to do is to stay calm and let your mind lead you through the problem.
Is that a motto you find lacking too many times among young people today?
I don't think they teach people how to deal with their frustrations. You never know what you're going to do if you lose your temper.
Because violence is born of your own internal frustrations?
It is.
When Dr. King was leading the movement, he told you at one point, you'd all have to be crazy to think such a ragtag group could redeem America's soul from the triple evil of racism and war and poverty. Was he expressing self-doubt or the importance in believing in something that seems impossible?
I think he was expressing real pride that we were fools for Christ. Whatever we did, however dangerous or however stupid it seemed, there was a reason for it.
Dr. King was a workaholic. Didn't get a whole lot of sleep.
No.
Always struggled, always worked.
Yeah.
Now, wherever his spirit is he resting or is he still struggling?
I think he's still struggling. His dream was never for black Americans only. His dream was for the least of these God's children. And as long as there's somebody somewhere hungry, right now this is a time of great agony for him, wherever he is and whatever he's doing.
So as Dr. King would say, and as you have many times have said, there's no rest for the wicked and the righteous don't need it.
That's a good phrase. That was one of his phrases. No rest for the wicked and the righteous don't need it.
So even in the peace and joy of heaven, he's still going.
Yep.
Dr. King also made light of death in a certain way. Try to make you feel comfortable with death, kind of by roasting you in a mock wake, as it were.
He would, and he'd say things like, you know you're going to die. And he said, you don't have anything to say about when you die, where you die, how you die. Your only choice is what is it you give your life for? And he said, I know there's a bullet waiting for me somewhere. He said, but I figure you all are always jumping in front of me trying to get your picture on television or in a newspaper, that you take the first bullet for me. So I got a little time. And then he said, the only thing is, and he'd pick somebody out from our staff, if you take a bullet for me, then I got a really difficult task. He said, I have to figure out how to preach your sorry behind into heaven.
And then he'd say things you might not want said at your memorial.
No, he would say everything you wouldn't want said at your memorial. I think he really focused on the importance of death in forcing us or helping us to make our lives meaningful. Martin would say, if you haven't found something you're willing to die for, you're not fit to live anyway.
Ambassador Young, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Coming up, Dr. Bernice King reflects on her father's dream and what more we can do to keep it alive. Dr. King's legacy lives in the works of the King Center, which is led by his daughter Bernice.
Well, Dr. Bernice King, thank you so much for hosting us here at the King Center and for your time.
Thank you so much. We appreciate you being here.
Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech. He said he dreamed of a world in which his children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. To this day, are you and your siblings, in your mind, judged by the color of your skin?
I mean, I do think there are spaces and places where I find myself that I can experience some of the either subtle or overt kinds of racism or discrimination based off of the skin color, the type of treatment you receive. So they don't know I'm Dr. King's daughter. So I do think that those of us in the Black community still deal with that, you know.
What more can all of us do to address it?
Daddy said, you know, men hate each other because they fear each other. They fear each other because they don't know each other. They don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they're separated from each other. And I think part of the reason he was working towards getting society more integrated, meaning where we would be more connected in all of these different spaces and places, is so that we would begin to know each other and communicate with each other. And then some of these walls of fear and anxiety and distrust and misjudgment wouldn't take place. He dreamed of that world, but we're not there yet. We still have to work on eradicating all forms of racism.
When we come back, Dr. Bernice King's call to action and what she finds missing. We continue our conversation with Dr. Bernice King with a closer look at her father's legacy.
Dr. King has something in common with President Lincoln in that both were reviled in life, largely, and then revered in spirit. Mm-hmm. What drove that kind of change in our national perspective? Yes, but President Garfield was assassinated, President McKinley was assassinated. We don't have monuments to them.
Yeah, but I say my mom, because Coretta Scott King championed that legacy. She was the architect of the legacy. She spent an enormous amount of time trying to help people to understand what Martin, as she would say, was trying to do. He loved America, but he loved the world too. He loved humanity.
I would add something that made him particularly effective, and that was strategy. He worked against patterns to find ways to do things in such a way that they succeeded. Mm-hmm. And he was very careful in his planning. Very careful. Do you find that lacking in generations, particularly younger generations today?
I find strategy missing, period. I think this is the vocal generation. This is the generation that's very passionate about change. This is also the generation that's not going to let us go back to sleep. Let me just say that. But now, how do they move from just speaking up to really translating this into substantial change is where there's the gap that's just missing. And that has to do with what you're saying, strategy.
Well, we also have something else on that point that Dr. King did not have in his day, and that is social media. Remarkable way to connect people and motivate and organize, but it's also remarkably effective in fracturing our community and in whipping up anger and fear and spreading misinformation. How would he have countered the challenges of social media in his time if it was around back then, and how do we address it today?
You can use it as a tool of mobilization, but when it comes time to do the work of strategizing and figuring out, that kind of stuff has to take place outside of social media. And I just think that's what he would do. And he would do some of the things, and I'm not my father by any means, but I think he would do some of the things that I'm trying to do, which is to elevate the conversation and not be about just canceling people or calling people out, but calling people in. The way our world and universe is made, there's no escaping it. We are interconnected, we're interrelated. Whatever state the world was in, that's the way we found it. So don't blame me. I was just born, but let's get together and work it out. That's my philosophy in life.
Dr. Bernice King, thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for watching our presentation of the civil rights leaders and Florida's foot soldiers who inspired change and still do through dignity and peace.